Hey guys, tonight we begin with something calm, dimly lit, and slightly unsettling in a very polite British way. So go ahead and lower the brightness on your screen. Maybe turn the volume down just a touch. Get comfortable, because tonight we're not talking about wars or revolutions or grand heroic moments. We're talking about a man who had money, power, land, servants, and still decided that the best possible way to live was to avoid other human beings for about 4 decades straight. This is the story of the fifth Duke of Portland, a man who inherited one of the largest fortunes in Britain and then quietly turned his entire life into a long running social experiment in isolation, silence, and in architectural spite. And yes, of course he did. Now, before we drift too far, let's set the mood. This is not a story about danger or drama. There are no sword fights, no rebellions, no screaming crowds. It's mostly paperwork, inherited trauma, strange habits, and a truly unhinged number of underground hallways. Very soothing stuff. So let's ease into it. William John Cavendish Scott Bentinck was born in 1800, right at the turn of a century that would become loud, industrial, crowded, and extremely fond of other people, which already feels like a mismatch. He was born into the highest tier of British aristocracy. Old money, deep roots, the kind of family where the last name alone opens doors, closes mouths, and pays for entire buildings. He was the second son of the fourth Duke of Portland, which meant at birth he wasn't really expected to become, well, anything in particular. The eldest son usually takes the title, the estate, the expectations. The younger ones are sort of spare dukes. They get polite careers, politics, the church, something respectable and quiet. And for a while, William seemed perfectly suited to a quiet, background existence. He was described as intelligent, reserved, and deeply uncomfortable around people, which in aristocratic circles is usually framed as thoughtful or private instead of alarming. As a child, he already showed signs of intense shyness, not the charming, bookish kind, the kind where you'd rather leave the room entirely than make eye contact. He spoke very little. He avoided social gatherings, and when he did appear in public, he tended to fade into the background like an expensive piece of furniture no one remembered ordering. Still, no one was particularly worried, because again, second son, low expectations. Let him be odd, the family had spares. Except, life as always had other plans. In 1854, William unexpectedly inherited the title of Duke of Portland after his older brother died without producing a legitimate heir. And just like that, the quiet man who preferred silence became one of the wealthiest and most powerful landowners in Britain, which is usually the part of the story where someone steps into the spotlight, takes responsibility, hosts dinners, shakes hands, attends Parliament. William did the opposite. Almost immediately after becoming Duke, he began to withdraw from society at a level that was difficult to ignore. Not dramatic withdrawal, no scandal, no announcement, just a slow, deliberate vanishing. He stopped attending public events. He declined invitations. He stopped visiting London. He stopped receiving guests. He stopped seeing friends. Eventually, he stopped being seen at all. And this is where things start getting gently strange. William took up residence primarily at Welbeck Abbey, the family estate in Nottinghamshire, a vast, sprawling property that had been home to the Portland family for generations. Instead of enjoying it in the traditional aristocratic way, balls, hunts, visitors, He began to redesign it to suit a life almost entirely unseen. Over the years, the Duke commissioned an enormous network of underground tunnels beneath the estate, and not just small passages, wide corridors, long hallways, entire underground roads, some large enough for horse drawn carriages to pass through. These tunnels connected different parts of the estate so he could move around without being seen by servants, guests, or anyone really, because apparently being a duke wasn't enough. He needed stealth mode. One of the most famous tunnels led from his private apartments directly to the riding school. That way, he could mount a horse indoors, ride unseen, and dismount without encountering another human face, which is honestly impressive dedication to avoidance. Now, if you're wondering, did he hate people? The answer is not exactly. There's no evidence he was cruel, angry, or aggressive. He paid his staff well. He funded local improvements. He wasn't violent or abusive. He just didn't want to interact at all. He communicated with his servants almost entirely through written notes. Instructions were left on tables, requests were slipped under doors, responses were written back. Verbal communication was rare, and when it happened, it was usually brief, quiet, and intensely uncomfortable for everyone involved. Some servants worked for him for years without ever hearing his voice. And yes, that includes the ones who lived in the same building. He also developed an intense aversion to being looked at. Curtains were drawn constantly. Windows were covered. Servants were instructed to avert their eyes if he passed. If someone accidentally encountered him face to face, it was treated like a minor disaster. He would immediately retreat. They would pretend nothing happened. Everyone would carry on, slightly more tense than before. Over time, the estate itself adapted to his preferences. Rooms were redesigned, corridors rerouted, entire sections of the house were closed off or repurposed. Welbeck Abbey became less of a home and more of a carefully controlled environment designed to minimize the risk of human contact. And again, this went on for decades. For roughly 40 years, the Duke lived this way. No wife, no children, no close friendships, no public life, just silence, tunnels, and notes. Naturally, rumors began to spread. Some claimed he was horribly disfigured and didn't want to be seen. Others suggested mental illness, or paranoia, or trauma. There were even stories that he only went out at night, dressed in disguises, moving like a ghost through his own property. Most of these rumors were exaggerated. There's no solid evidence he was disfigured. Portraits suggest he looked fine, a bit stern, a bit tired, but nothing unusual for a Victorian aristocrat who avoided joy. More likely, he suffered from extreme social anxiety, possibly compounded by depression. But of course, in the 19th century, that wasn't really a diagnosis. It was just eccentricity, and aristocrats were allowed a lot of that. Despite his isolation, the Duke wasn't entirely disconnected from the world. He managed his estates efficiently. He invested wisely. He supported agricultural improvements. He even funded public works, including a hospital. He just didn't want to talk about it, or attend anything, or be thanked, or seen. In a way, he treated society like background noise, necessary, but best kept at a distance. One of the most fascinating aspects of his life is how methodical it all was. This wasn't a breakdown. It wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a carefully maintained system. Every detail of his environment was designed to support his chosen level of isolation, which raises a quiet, uncomfortable question. Was this suffering, or was this, in his own strange way, peace? He lived exactly how he wanted. No forced dinners, no awkward conversations, no expectations to perform sociability. Just control, quiet, and routine. Of course, the world outside didn't stop. Victorian Britain was loud, expanding, obsessed with progress and visibility. Meanwhile, one of its richest men was quietly disappearing underground. When the Duke finally died in 1879, he left behind no direct heirs. The title passed to a distant cousin, and suddenly Welbeck Abbey was opened up again. Servants, visitors, and later historians began to fully explore the underground world he had built. The tunnels, the rooms, the strange layout of a life designed to avoid contact. It was only then that the full scale of his isolation became clear. 5th Duke of Portland quietly underground, alive, wealthy, organized, and deeply committed to not being perceived. So now, let's just wander a little more slowly through the world he built. Because if you're going to avoid people for 4 decades, you might as well do it with planning, brickwork, and a frankly impressive budget. Welbeck Abbey, on the surface, looked like any other grand English estate. Big house, rolling land, respectable history. Nothing too alarming, nothing screaming. There is a man down here who hasn't spoken out loud in weeks. But beneath that polite exterior was an entirely different universe. The Duke's underground constructions weren't improvised or chaotic. They were engineered with precision, measured, purposeful. This wasn't a bunker. It wasn't a hiding place. It was an alternate version of daily life, just below ground and quieter. One of the largest underground spaces was the riding school. Above ground, horses are loud. They breathe, they snort. People watch you ride them. Below ground, however, everything is controlled. The Duke could ride indoors, unseen, without the discomfort of accidental human interaction. No onlookers, no greetings, no expectations to make small talk about the weather or horse breeding. Just horse, tunnel, silence. There were underground kitchens as well, which meant food could be prepared and delivered without servants needing to move visibly through shared spaces. Meals appeared, notes were exchanged, and no one had to stand in the same room long enough to acknowledge each other's existence. Even the ventilation systems were carefully planned. Fresh air flowed through shafts hidden from view. Light entered selectively, filtered and softened. It's almost poetic, if you ignore the part where it's deeply concerning. Now, servants at Welbeck had very specific instructions. They were not to speak unless spoken to. They were not to look directly at the Duke. And if they heard him approaching, they were to turn away or leave the area entirely, which means working there required a kind of reverse awareness. You had to know where he was in order not to see him. Some servants reportedly recognized his presence by sound alone. The faint echo of footsteps, the subtle movement of air, the gentle reminder that the Duke existed somewhere nearby, but not for interaction. And despite all of this, he was not considered cruel. He paid his staff generously. He ensured their housing was adequate. He funded improvements to the estate and local area, which created a strange dynamic. They were well cared for by a man who did not want to see them. This wasn't neglect. It was distance. In Victorian England, eccentric aristocrats were almost expected. One collected beetles, Another believed he was made of glass. Someone else insisted on dining alone with portraits. But the Duke of Portland was different because his eccentricity wasn't performative. It wasn't a party trick or a conversation starter. It was systematic. Okay, and this is where people started to struggle to explain him. Doctors speculated, relatives whispered, journalists invented theories. Some claimed he had been humiliated earlier in life and never recovered. Others believed he suffered from a fear of crowds, or eye contact, or judgment. There were rumors of childhood trauma, or a failed romance, but no dramatic origin story ever surfaced, which is somehow more unsettling because it suggests that this wasn't a reaction. It was a preference. He didn't run away from society. He slowly adjusted reality until society stopped reaching him, and money made that possible. This is an important part of the story because most people with extreme social anxiety don't get to redesign their environment to this degree. They cope, they struggle, they compromise. The Duke did not need to compromise. If he didn't want to see people, he didn't. If he didn't want to speak, he wrote. If he didn't want to be visible, he went underground. Literally. His life became a controlled experiment in minimal human contact. One variable changed, proximity to others. Everything else remained stable. And so, he functioned. He wasn't chaotic. He wasn't neglectful. He wasn't descending into madness. He simply removed what he found uncomfortable. And that raises another gentle question. If someone lives quietly, causes no harm, fulfills their responsibilities, and prefers solitude, at what point does eccentricity become pathology? Victorian society never really answered that. They mostly just shrugged and said, well, he's a duke. Over time, however, the isolation did deepen. The Duke became increasingly reclusive as he aged. His movements became more predictable, his routines tighter. He slept during the day and stayed awake at night when the estate was quiet. Not because he was hiding, just because fewer people were around, which again makes sense in its own way. As years passed, the rumors grew louder outside the estate walls. The man who no one saw became more interesting than the man himself. Some claimed he was insane, others called him tragic. A few romanticized him as a misunderstood genius, but none of those labels quite fit. He wasn't ranting. He wasn't creating art or philosophy. He wasn't leaving behind manifestos or journals. He just lived and quietly adjusted the world until it felt tolerable. There's something oddly modern about that. Today, we talk about boundaries, about overstimulation, about burnout. The Duke just built tunnels. Now let's float gently toward the end of his life. As the Duke aged, his health declined as it tends to do. Even underground, time finds you. He continued his routines as long as he could. Notes, solitude, carefully controlled movement. When he finally died in 1879, he did so quietly as expected. No public mourning, no grand funeral procession that he would have hated. And then the silence broke. The estate passed to his successor, who did not share his preferences. Rooms were opened, tunnels explored, spaces mapped. People finally saw the scale of what had been hidden, and instead of fear or disgust, many felt something else, a strange kind of melancholy, because what they discovered wasn't a lair, it wasn't a dungeon, it wasn't evidence of cruelty. It was a life arranged around avoidance, an entire fortune spent not on excess or indulgence, but on peace. Of course, historians still debate him. Was he ill? Was he traumatized? Was he simply introverted to an extreme degree? The answer is probably yes, to all of it, a little. But what remains undeniable is this. For 40 years, one of Britain's most powerful men lived largely unseen, unheard, and untouched by the social expectations of his class. He didn't rebel. He didn't reform society. He didn't make a statement. He just quietly stepped aside, and in doing so, he left behind one of the strangest aristocratic lives in British history. Because now that the fifth Duke of Portland is gone, quietly, predictably, without causing a scene, we're left with something that history doesn't always know what to do with. A man who didn't fail, didn't fall, didn't explode. He just opted out. And that makes people uneasy. When the Duke died in 1879, Victorian society had already decided that isolation was suspicious. This was an age obsessed with productivity, visibility, and moral improvement. People were meant to be seen doing things, attending things, contributing loudly. So when Welbeck Abbey was opened up, curiosity flooded in. Visitors walked through halls that hadn't echoed with conversation in decades. They descended into tunnels built not for secrecy, but for comfort. They saw rooms designed around a single occupant who preferred not to be observed. And instead of finding madness, they found order. Everything was labeled. Everything had a purpose. Everything worked, which made interpretation harder. If he'd been chaotic, historians could have dismissed him. If he'd been cruel, moral judgment would be easy. If he'd been dramatic, biographies would write themselves. But he wasn't. So the story of the Duke slowly became something else, a cautionary tale, a curiosity, a mirror people didn't love looking into. Victorian writers began framing him as a warning about isolation. Too much solitude, they implied, leads to decay, to emotional stagnation. And maybe they weren't entirely wrong, but there's a subtle dishonesty there, because the Duke didn't decay in any obvious way. He managed his estate. He funded improvements. He remained consistent. He just didn't socialize, and that made people nervous. As time passed, Welbeck Abbey became something like a historical puzzle. Architects marveled at the engineering. Psychologists speculated from a distance. Biographers tried to retroactively diagnose a man who left no confessions. Every generation projected its own anxieties onto him. In the early 20th century, he was framed as a tragic recluse. Mid-century writers leaned toward mental illness. More recent historians have begun to consider social anxiety and neurodivergence. But here's the thing. The Duke never asked to be understood. He left no diary explaining himself, no final letter clarifying his choices, no instructions on how to interpret his life, which means the story we tell about him says more about us than it does about him. We're uncomfortable with someone who had every reason to participate and chose not to. We want a reason. We want justification. We want closure. And history doesn't always give us that. In fact, the Duke's life quietly challenges one of the most persistent assumptions we have about success. That visibility equals fulfillment. The Duke had wealth, security, influence, and yet his definition of a good life seemed to center around peace, predictability, and absence. He didn't try to be remembered. He didn't shape public opinion. He didn't leave behind a legacy project. And still, here we are, talking about him, which is ironic. Now let's gently widen the lens for a moment. The Duke of Portland was not the only aristocrat to withdraw from society. History is full of elites who retreated inward once the obligations of title became overwhelming. Some became obsessive collectors, some drowned themselves in ritual, others clung to rigid schedules or superstitions. Isolation is a theme that repeats itself, especially among those who are never allowed to fail publicly. Because when you're born into expectation, there's often nowhere to step down to. The Duke didn't abdicate. He didn't renounce his title. He simply minimized contact, a quiet workaround. And maybe that's why his story endures, because it feels familiar. Modern life is loud, constant, performative. Many people fantasize about disappearing, not dying, just not being reachable. No notifications, no obligations, no small talk. The Duke just took that fantasy and funded it. Now, this doesn't mean his life was ideal. Isolation has costs, emotional ones especially. He never married, never had children, never built a personal legacy beyond architecture and rumor. And yet, there's no evidence he regretted this. No last minute confessions, no deathbed apologies, no sudden longing for connection, just continuity, which leaves us with an oddly neutral ending. Not tragic, not triumphant, just complete. When the tunnels were later opened to the public, visitors described them as eerie, but not frightening, spacious, clean, purpose built, not the hiding place of a man in fear, but the living space of someone who simply preferred less contact. And that's where we'll slowly bring this to rest. The fifth Duke of Portland didn't change the world. He didn't improve society. He didn't destroy anything. He just lived quietly, on his own terms, beneath the expectations placed on him. And perhaps that's why his story lingers, because it suggests something uncomfortable. That fulfillment doesn't always look impressive, that solitude isn't always failure, and that sometimes the most radical choice is to quietly step out of the room. By the time the story of the fifth Duke of Portland reached the modern world, something interesting had happened. People stopped trying to fix him. Earlier, historians wanted causes, doctors wanted diagnoses, Victorian moralists wanted lessons. But later generations, especially in the last few decades, started doing something much quieter. They just described him. No judgment, no melodrama, just observation. And maybe that's the most fitting way to end his story. Because if there's one thing the Duke consistently resisted, it was interpretation forced onto him by other people. He didn't explain himself in life, and he didn't correct anyone in death. He left behind architecture, routines, and absence. And absence is strangely difficult to narrate. Today, Welbeck Abbey still exists. The tunnels are preserved. Some are accessible, others remain closed, intentionally quiet. Not because they're dangerous, but because silence is part of their meaning. When visitors walk through the underground passages, guides tend to lower their voices, not out of necessity, out of instinct. The space asks for it, and that, perhaps, is the Duke's most enduring legacy. Not wealth, not title, but atmosphere. A life so intentionally subdued that it reshaped the behavior of people long after he was gone. There's no grand monument to him, no towering statue pointing heroically into the distance, just corridors, rooms without echoes, doors that once existed solely to be closed. And if that feels underwhelming, that's kind of the point. The Duke of Portland forces us to confront a question history usually avoids. What if a life doesn't want to be inspiring? What if it just wants to be tolerable? We tend to celebrate figures who endure suffering publicly, who transformed pain into art or leadership or reform. The Duke didn't do that. He removed the suffering where he could and accepted what remained. There's something quietly radical about that. Of course, this doesn't mean isolation is ideal. Most humans need connection, and prolonged solitude often carries emotional costs we can't see from the outside. But history is full of people who suffered loudly and still didn't change anything. The Duke suffered quietly and at least achieved peace on his own terms. That doesn't make him a hero or a cautionary tale, just a person who found a solution that worked for him. And that makes his story harder to package because there's no moral ribbon to tie around it, no neat ending. Just a man who stepped back, stayed consistent, and left the world more or less as he found it, which for someone of his status is actually unusual. Most dukes leave chaos. He left corridors, and with that, we can let him rest. No more speculation, no more theories, no need to pull him into the light. The Duke of Portland lived quietly, and history, for once, doesn't need to be louder than he was. So as we close this story, you can let your thoughts drift the way his life did, slow, contained, unbothered by expectation. We're talking about the 19th century vampire panic of New England, which right away sounds much cooler than it actually was, because this wasn't capes and castles and seductive immortals. This was tuberculosis, cold winters, tired farming families, and a deep misunderstanding of how lungs work, and somehow, vampires. Now let's gently drift back to rural New England in the early to mid 1800s. Picture small towns, sparse populations, long winters. Everyone knows everyone else, and everyone is slightly suspicious of everyone else. Medical science exists technically, but it's still mostly vibes and guesswork. Doctors are doing their best, but germs haven't really been invited to the conversation yet. This is the era when people are dying slowly, not dramatically, not heroically, just coughing, fading, losing weight, getting quieter. The disease responsible was tuberculosis. Back then, it went by friendlier names like consumption, because it seemed to consume people from the inside out, which honestly is not an inaccurate description. Entire families would get sick one by one. A mother would die, then a daughter, then a brother. Each death spaced out over months or even years. And here's where the human brain, being what it is, starts looking for patterns. Because humans are very uncomfortable with randomness. We prefer our tragedies to have villains. So some communities began to believe that the first person to die wasn't really done dying. They believed the dead were lingering, draining life from their relatives, slowly, invisibly, from the grave, not in a flashy way, more like a long-distance subscription service of suffering. And so, without anyone officially announcing it, a belief quietly took hold in parts of New England. The dead could prey on the living. Now let's pause here and gently acknowledge something important. These people were not stupid. They were scared. They were grieving. They were watching their families disappear in slow motion. And when modern medicine doesn't give you answers, folklore tends to step in like, well, I've got a theory. The idea wasn't always called vampirism. Sometimes it was just referred to as the influence, or the notion that a dead family member was somehow feeding on the living, which again sounds dramatic, but the response to this belief was anything but dramatic. There were no torches, no mobs, No dramatic speeches. Instead, there were town meetings, quiet discussions, and eventually permission to do something deeply unsettling but done very politely. They would exhume the body. Now, if you're imagining screaming or fainting or hysteria, you can let that go. These were practical people, farmers, neighbors. The grave would be opened calmly, often months or even years after burial, and then they would look. They were searching for signs that the body was not behaving properly, which is a vague standard, but they had a checklist. If the corpse looked unusually well preserved, suspicious. If there was liquid blood, definitely suspicious. If the organs seemed intact, extremely suspicious. From a modern perspective, this is where we quietly sigh, because cold New England soil can preserve bodies quite well, and decomposition doesn't follow a strict schedule. But to a grieving family, seeing blood in the heart of a dead loved one was not science, it was confirmation. And once confirmed, something had to be done. The most common solution was surprisingly methodical. The heart would be removed, sometimes burned, sometimes mixed with ashes, and given to the sick family member to drink. Which, yes, sounds worse the longer you think about it, so we won't think about it too much. Other times, the body would be repositioned, turned face down, just in case it was trying to get up. Again, very calm logic, very wrong, but calm. Now, this wasn't happening everywhere. It was isolated, rural, and usually tied to specific families experiencing repeated loss. One of the most famous cases, and we'll float gently toward it later in this story, occurred in Rhode Island in the 1890s, which is surprisingly late. Electric lights existed, photography existed, and yet, so did vampire panic, because fear does not retire just because technology improves. In many towns, these practices were not hidden. They were community approved, sometimes even encouraged by local doctors, which feels strange until you remember that doctors at the time were also deeply confused. And when science doesn't have answers, it sometimes shrugs and says, well, if it helps. What's fascinating is how restrained this panic was compared to European witch hunts. No mass executions, no accusations against strangers. This fear stayed inside families. It was intimate, almost tender in a grim way. People weren't hunting monsters, they were trying to save their children, and that makes it harder to dismiss, because underneath the superstition was love and exhaustion and a deep sense of helplessness. Now, while this belief was strongest in New England, it wasn't unique to America. Similar ideas existed in parts of Eastern Europe, but in New England, it adapted to local culture. No garlic, no coffins lined with silver, just earth, wood, and lungs slowly failing. One interesting detail is that these communities didn't always blame the most recent dead. Sometimes suspicion fell on someone who had died years earlier, especially if their grave showed signs, and signs were flexible. If a coffin collapsed inward, well, obviously they were moving around. If hair or nails appeared longer, that was growth, not skin retracting, clearly. If the body smelled less terrible than expected, suspiciously polite corpse. And once the idea took hold, it was hard to let go, because what else could explain why the sick weren't getting better? Doctors prescribed rest, fresh air, and hope. The vampire theory at least gave people something to do, and doing something feels better than waiting. By the mid 1800s, newspapers occasionally mentioned these events, usually with a tone of mild embarrassment, as if saying, Yes, this happened, but let's all agree not to dwell on it. Urban Americans liked to imagine this was a rural problem, a backwoods issue, something modern people were above. And yet, fear has a way of resurfacing in familiar shapes. As tuberculosis spread, so did the belief that it wasn't entirely natural, that something unseen was stealing breath in the night. Now, before we drift too far ahead, let's pause and sit with the atmosphere for a moment. Imagine a farmhouse in winter. The windows frost over early. Someone is coughing in the next room. Every cough sounds heavier than the last. The family has already buried two relatives. They are tired, they are afraid, and someone quietly says, "What if it isn't over?" That's how vampire panic begins, not with screams, but with whispers. In the next part, we'll begin to meet specific families, real people, with names, with dates. We'll see how communities responded, how officials reacted, and how one case in particular became the most famous American vampire story ever recorded. But for now, just let the quiet settle, the cold soil, the slow breathing, the sense that something unseen is wrong. Consumption was cruel in a very specific way. It didn't strike all at once. It lingered. Someone might be sick for years. They would improve slightly, then decline again. And crucially, it spread within families, parents to children, siblings to siblings, spouses to each other. But to a 19th century observer, this didn't look like a contagious disease. It looked targeted, intentional, almost personal. One person would die, and then, months later, another family member would show the exact same symptoms, the same coughing, the same wasting away, the same pale exhaustion. At some point, people stopped asking if someone else would get sick and started asking who was next. This is where the vampire explanation became strangely logical, because if a dead person was draining life from the living, it would explain the pattern. Why families were affected instead of whole towns. Why the illness followed bloodlines. It wasn't random, it was selective. And once that idea took root, families began reviewing their dead, not emotionally, practically. Who died first? Who was buried closest? Who seemed unfinished when they passed? Often, suspicion fell on the first victim of tuberculosis in the household. They became, posthumously, the problem. And that must have been a very strange emotional shift. To mourn someone deeply, and then quietly begin to blame them. Now, exhumations weren't automatic. They were usually a last resort, something discussed in hushed conversations. Families would consult neighbors, sometimes clergy, occasionally a doctor, and when enough people nodded and said, yes, maybe something isn't right, permission would be granted. The grave would be opened. This usually happened early in the morning. Cool air, minimal attention. Again, this wasn't a spectacle. It was more like maintenance. And then came the inspection. People expected decomposition to follow a neat schedule, but bodies don't cooperate with expectations. Cold soil slows decay. Sealed coffins trap moisture. Gas buildup causes swelling. All normal processes, all deeply suspicious to someone expecting a skeleton. So when a body looked too good, it was alarming. If the heart still contained liquid blood, that was seen as proof. Proof that the dead were still somehow alive. And once proof was established, the solution followed. The heart was removed, sometimes burned on a stone, sometimes taken away and destroyed elsewhere. In a few cases, ashes were consumed by the sick family member, which was believed to break the connection. Again, we are not going to linger on that detail. Now, here's that unsettling part. After these rituals, sometimes the illness seemed to stop, not because the ritual worked, but because tuberculosis often runs its course unpredictably. If a sick person happened to stabilize or recover afterward, the ritual got the credit, and that reinforced the belief. Now let's talk geography for a moment, because vampire panic wasn't evenly distributed. It appeared mostly in rural New England, places like Rhode Island, Vermont, Connecticut, those small communities, limited medical access, strong family ties. These were places where death was familiar, but clustered death was not. Interestingly, larger cities were mostly spared this belief, not because people were smarter, but because illness looked different there. In cities, tuberculosis killed strangers, tenants, neighbors, co workers. But in rural towns, it felt intimate, personal, and intimacy breeds meaning. Another factor was religion. New England Protestantism had shifted away from older supernatural beliefs, but folk traditions lingered. People might not openly say vampire, but they believed in influence, in lingering effects of the dead. The dead were not gone, they were just quieter, and sometimes inconvenient. Now let's gently zoom in on a specific type of victim: children. Tuberculosis loved children, especially teenagers. A child would appear healthy, then tired, then thin. Parents would watch helplessly as appetite disappeared, energy faded, and if another child had already died, panic set in. Parents began looking backward instead of forward, searching the past for the cause of the future. Which brings us to one of the most emotionally heavy elements of this story: the rewriting of grief. Imagine burying a daughter, years later digging her up, and believing, truly believing, that she was harming her siblings. That's not superstition for entertainment. That's grief trying to survive. And it was often the parents who initiated these rituals, not out of cruelty, but desperation. Now, not everyone agreed with these practices. There were skeptics, doctors who argued against it, clergy who discouraged it. But skepticism moves slowly when funerals keep happening. And here's something quietly ironic. By the late 1800s, medical science was beginning to understand tuberculosis. Germ theory was emerging. Sanatoriums were being built. And yet, some of the most famous vampire panic cases happened after this progress began, because knowledge spreads unevenly, and fear spreads faster, which brings us gently toward the most famous American vampire case of all. Her name was Mercy Lana Brown. We won't rush into her story yet, but she lived in Rhode Island. She died in 1892. That's not medieval. That's not colonial. That's almost modern. And what happened to her body would become the defining image of American vampire folklore. But before we reach Mercy, we need to understand one more thing. These events didn't feel strange to the people living through them. They felt responsible. Families believed they were doing what had to be done, what tradition allowed, what community accepted. And once the ritual was completed, there was often relief, a sense that something had finally been addressed. Even if nothing changed medically, emotionally, something shifted. And in that sense, vampire panic functioned like a coping mechanism, a terrible one, but a human one. As tuberculosis continued its quiet rampage, these practices slowly faded, not because people suddenly stopped believing, but because science began offering better explanations. Sanitation improved, isolation reduced spread, and eventually antibiotics arrived. And with them, The need for undead scapegoats disappeared, but the memory lingered, stories passed down, newspapers archived, graves disturbed and reburied. In one case, one young woman would come to represent all of it. In the next part, we'll finally meet Mercy Brown. We'll talk about her family, her death, and the calm, almost procedural way her body was turned into a symbol of fear. Now we gently arrive at Mercy Brown. She lived in a small town in Rhode Island in the late 19th century. Her family, quiet, hard-working farmers, had already endured several losses to tuberculosis. Her mother had died first, then an older sister, and finally Mercy herself at just 19 years old. Her death, slow and expected, should have been just another sad moment in the long pattern of illness. But in this case, it was not, because shortly after Mercy's passing, her younger brother Edwin fell ill. Again, the familiar coughing, the gradual wasting away, the same disease that had claimed so many in the family. And that's when the quiet fear turned inward. The family began to wonder, could Mercy be influencing him from beyond the grave? A local doctor, who had seen similar cases before, suggested something unusual, a ritual, an exhumation, to see if the dead were somehow still draining the living. And so, very calmly, the decision was made. Her grave was opened, her body examined, and what they found would cement Mercy Brown as the most famous vampire in American history. The heart still appeared intact. The body showed little decomposition, which to them was suspicious. It was decided that the heart, and sometimes other organs, would be burned, and the ashes offered to the sick brother as a last desperate attempt to break the cycle. This was not horror theater. It was quiet desperation, a slow, tragic ritual born of love and fear. After her exhumation and the ritual burning of her heart, something subtly shifted. Her younger brother, Edwin, who had been fading, slowly stabilized, not because the ritual had any real effect on tuberculosis, but because, as often happens, the disease ran its unpredictable course. The family, relieved, quietly returned to their routines. The farm continued, the seasons turned, and the extraordinary fear that had gripped them for months gradually faded. Mercy Brown's name, however, did not disappear. Local newspapers had already reported on the incident, treating it as a peculiar human interest story. By the early 20th century, historians and folklorists would revisit it, turning Mercy into the symbolic New England vampire. What's important here is to note the context. These families weren't superstitious thrill seekers. They were grieving, exhausted, confronted with a disease they could neither understand nor control. Vampire panic, in this sense, was less about monsters and more about coping. It was a desperate attempt to impose order on randomness, to feel some measure of control in the face of relentless loss. After Mercy, other similar cases slowly disappeared. Medical understanding of tuberculosis improved. Sanatoriums and isolation practices reduced its spread, and eventually, antibiotics rendered the supernatural explanations obsolete. But the story remains quietly fascinating. It tells us about fear, grief, and the human need for explanations, even when they are a little wrong. It reminds us that even in the rational, progressive late 19th century, the shadow of the unknown could still reach into small towns, whispering doubts about the dead. And so, Mercy Brown rests, her heart burned, St. Louis, Missouri, in the year 1904. You know, the world was full of optimism back then, the kind of optimism that thinks sending a bunch of men to run 26 miles in near death conditions sounds like a perfectly good Saturday afternoon. Now, the 1904 Olympics weren't exactly what we think of today. No sleek stadiums, no high tech gear, no motivational playlists. This was basically an attempt to combine international athletic competition with let's see how badly we can mismanage a long distance race. And spoiler alert, it went about as smoothly as you'd expect from a century old invention that no one really thought through. So the marathon, it was supposed to be 24.85 miles because apparently the metric system was still optional in America at the time. The roads were dusty, unpaved, and occasionally shared with wagons and livestock, which is charming in a rustic sort of way, if you're into that sort of thing. But for the runners, it was less charming, more suffocating. The field was a peculiar mix of athletes. There were seasoned distance runners, yes, but also a few entrants who, for reasons lost to history, probably thought, hey, I like walking, long walks, let's try a marathon. There was even a guy named Thomas Hicks who would eventually win the race, but only after a cocktail of strychnine and brandy. And yes, you heard that correctly, strychnine, which is a poison. But apparently, in 1904, if a little poison helps you keep going, that counts as sportsmanship. The race started in the morning heat, with the sun already conspiring against anyone with a functioning sense of survival. And the organizers, in a move of thoughtful incompetence, provided only 2 water stations along the entire route, because hydration is overrated. Or maybe they thought dehydration builds character. Either way, it did a spectacular job of making sure the marathon was less about running and more about who could survive mild to moderate hallucinations while jogging. As the race progressed, we start meeting some of the more memorable characters. Fred Lors, an American, decided that the road was a suggestion, not a requirement. About halfway through, he hitched a ride in a car for a good stretch, napped a bit, and then casually strolled across the finish line. Unsurprisingly, this initially made him the winner until the authorities, after a polite conversation involving some mild embarrassment, pointed out that using a vehicle to cheat was frowned upon. He was disqualified, naturally. And then there was the story of William Billy Garcia, a man who suffered a severe case of dust inhalation, likely worsened by the passing wagons, and finished covered in dirt like a tragic extra from a spaghetti western. He didn't place, but he did achieve the sort of accidental endurance record that makes you squint at history and say, well, that happened. Meanwhile, back to Thomas Hicks, the eventual winner. He limped along the course in a state somewhere between exhausted human and zombie on vacation. His trainers, in a very early form of performance enhancing encouragement, administered small doses of strychnine and brandy to keep him moving. Because, again, why not? And so, by the time he crossed the finish line, he was technically victorious, but practically collapsed into a state that looked like he had been run over by a few wagons himself. Not the ideal day at the office, but hey, gold medal. The conditions were such that less than half the runners actually finished. One man, a South African named Len Townyan, was chased by aggressive dogs for a portion of the course. It's not clear whether this was intentional, accidental, or a reflection of the local fauna's opinion on international athletics. But either way, he survived, which is commendable, and finished the race with dignity, if also with some deep seated mistrust of domestic canines. By the end of the day, the marathon was remembered not for heroic athleticism, but for the quiet absurdity of it all. Men collapsing, hallucinating, hitching rides, or being chased by animals. In hindsight, it's a perfect example of how early sports often bordered on social experiments in human suffering. And perhaps, in a strange way, that's comforting. We like to think our sports are civilized today, but at least we're not chasing a competitor with strychnine in hand while dodging dust clouds and wagons. Let's pause here, float gently in the absurdity of it all, and consider the quiet lesson. Humans, in extreme conditions, will endure almost anything, and sometimes they'll endure things that seem outright ridiculous, which is, in its own sleepy way, quite reassuring. So, as you settle further into your seat, we'll eventually move along to some of the quieter tragedies of other Olympic events. But for now, remember the 1904 marathon, not for glory, not for athletic achievement, but for its gentle, absurd chaos. A reminder that sometimes history is less about heroics and more about mildly uncomfortable survival. 1904 Marathon teaches us anything, it's that athletes are surprisingly good at enduring chaos and even better at creating it. Take Frederick Lors. Now Lors was, by all accounts, a decent runner under normal conditions. But the conditions in St. Louis were anything but normal. The heat was oppressive, dust thick enough to taste, and the water scarce. So when he decided to hitch a ride, it's tempting to think of it as cheating. But if you squint at it, it's also an ingenious survival strategy. That said, the officials didn't approve. They politely disqualified him, which is probably the most civilized response imaginable given the circumstances. He did, however, return to compete in later Olympics, presumably with a stronger understanding of what finish on your own 2 feet actually meant. Then there was Thomas Hicks, the official winner. Hicks was the sort of man who, on a normal day, probably enjoyed a calm walk in the park and a lukewarm cup of coffee. But on October 30th, 1904, he was something else entirely. A man staggering under the combined influence of heat exhaustion, strychnine, and brandy. His trainers were perhaps too enthusiastic about early performance enhancement, but Hicks, bless him, somehow made it across the finish line. And when he did, he didn't just win. He collapsed in a heap that looked less like triumph and more like someone discovering the harsh truth of long-distance running. Yet medals were awarded, photographs taken, and history quietly shrugged. A particularly fascinating story is that of Len Townyan, the South African runner who had the unique experience of being chased by dogs. Len was a former soldier, which perhaps prepared him for running while dodging aggressive canines. But still, being pursued during a marathon is not something you can really train for in any traditional sense. He managed to finish, dusty, tired, and slightly traumatized by domestic animals. He didn't win, but he did earn the kind of quiet respect that comes from surviving absurdity with dignity. Now let's gently consider the environment itself. The course was unpaved and shared with automobiles, wagons, and livestock. So every runner was essentially navigating an obstacle course of early 20th century Americana. You had men stumbling over rocks, inhaling clouds of dust, and occasionally being splashed by passing wagons. Water was scarce, as mentioned, which meant that runners were forced to choose between dehydration or drinking questionable liquids provided along the route. One particularly odd choice was an infusion of egg whites, which apparently some trainers believed would improve endurance. It's hard to say whether it helped, but it certainly added to the general sense of confusion and mild nausea. Speaking of confusion, there was also an American runner named William Garcia. Garcia suffered from severe cramps and dehydration early in the race. At one point, he reportedly passed out and was revived by sympathetic spectators. Unlike Hicks, he didn't receive any strychnine or brandy assistance, which is perhaps why he didn't finish in the top spots. Yet his perseverance remains quietly impressive. After all, continuing under these conditions requires a strange combination of stubbornness, poor judgment, and mild masochism. By the time the race concluded, less than half of the original competitors had crossed the finish line. Some collapsed mid-course, others wandered off in search of shade or food, and a few, like Lors, creatively avoided the worst of the exertion. In modern times, it's tempting to view this marathon as a simple historical anecdote, but at the time, it was a serious, organized athletic event. And yet, it felt like watching a slow-motion survival documentary, complete with dust clouds, hallucinations, and the occasional wandering dog. It's also worth noting the spectators. The marathon drew a modest crowd who mostly observed the chaos with mild curiosity. Some cheered, some laughed quietly, and others probably debated whether these men were athletes or mildly lost adventurers. The race organizers themselves seemed mostly preoccupied with ensuring that the event continued, occasionally shouting instructions and sometimes providing moral support. But mostly, they let the runners experience their slow, dusty ordeal in relative peace. And here's a gentle irony. The winner, Thomas Hicks, after all the strychnine and brandy administration, had to be carried off by his trainers. So the official champion of the 1904 marathon was essentially a man who couldn't walk unassisted, which somehow encapsulates the spirit of the entire event. It wasn't about speed or endurance or even athleticism in the modern sense. It was about the quiet, slow perseverance of humans in absurd circumstances. In reflecting on the aftermath, it becomes clear that the 1904 marathon wasn't just a race. It was a study in endurance, improvisation, and mild chaos. The organizers eventually made minor improvements in later Olympic marathons, such as increasing water availability and smoothing out course hazards. But in that first attempt, history was content to watch as a small group of men endured heat, dust, dogs, and even poison, all for the quiet recognition of a medal and a place in the record books. So as we let our minds drift over this scene, imagine it gently. Runners wobbling, collapsing, dust rising with every step, spectators murmuring softly, and a man slowly being revived with strychnine and brandy just across a finish line. It's absurd, yes, but also strangely soothing, because in a way, history often is more about quietly enduring ridiculous circumstances than achieving anything spectacular. And with that, 1904 marathon. You might think that once the runners crossed the finish line, the story would taper off quietly. But of course, this being the 1904 Olympics, it didn't. Instead, we're left with a series of minor controversies, quietly absurd incidents, and some bureaucratic confusion that could lull anyone to a calm, contemplative nap. First, the winner, Thomas Hicks. He received his gold medal, which is impressive considering the cocktail of strychnine, brandy, and extreme exhaustion that brought him there. The medal, as far as anyone remembers, was awarded in a polite ceremony, probably involving handshakes, faint smiles, and some very careful seated positioning. One imagines Hicks reclining gently on a chair, half dazed, half proud, with a trainer hovering nearby to make sure he didn't collapse again. And indeed, the sight must have quietly suggested that the Olympics were as much about survival as athleticism. Meanwhile, Frederick Lors, the man who had taken a little vehicular shortcut, initially claimed victory, which led to mild confusion among officials and spectators alike. When the truth came out that Lors had hitchhiked much of the course, the disqualification was quietly enforced. Lors apologized, not with great drama, but with a calm shrug, as though to say, well, I was tired, and cars are faster than legs. Later, he returned to compete in marathons without vehicular assistance, perhaps learning the subtle art of finishing without mechanical aid. And then there was the small matter of international participants, particularly those who had traveled great distances for what can only be described as a dusty, chaotic ordeal. The runners from other countries, accustomed to more conventional courses, were greeted with a mix of mild surprise, polite endurance, and an internal quiet thought along the lines of, why did I sign up for this? They navigated heat, dust, and the occasional loose dog with a resigned calm, which in retrospect makes their participation almost heroic, but in a sleepy, understated way. Another minor controversy arose from the conditions themselves. The course, as mentioned before, was unpaved, shared with wagons, and occasionally scattered with stray animals. This naturally led to some complaints about fairness. But the officials, in a very early form of bureaucratic pragmatism, basically shrugged and said, well, everyone had the same road, mostly. It was a quietly amusing solution, not exactly addressing the problem, but gently pretending that the chaos was part of the competition. And in a way, it was. The runners who survived it earned a subtle, almost sleepy kind of glory. The dust, by the way, was a persistent issue. Photographs from the era show runners coated in it, looking like mild ghosts of athletes rather than triumphant figures. Spectators may have offered water or brief assistance, but mostly the runners were left to their own devices, and in a strange, quiet way that added to the charm or mild tragedy of the event. You can almost imagine the organizers thinking, we've provided a start line and a finish line, the rest is character building. It's also worth noting the modest number of finishers. Less than half of the original entrants completed the course. Some dropped out quietly, stumbling into nearby shade or wandering into the crowd for consolation. Others pushed through with a kind of stubborn endurance that makes modern marathons look almost polite. And yet, no one fainted into hysteria, screamed in despair, or caused dramatic scenes. It was all gentle, slow chaos, the kind of historical narrative that's perfect for late night listening. In the aftermath, historians have noted the quiet absurdity of the event. The combination of extreme heat, poor hydration, strange performance enhancements, and dust-filled roads makes the 1904 marathon a peculiar chapter in Olympic history. And yet, it's also oddly charming. There's no grand triumph in the heroic sense, no dramatic speeches, no roaring crowds, just men enduring, faltering, and occasionally cheating, all under the sleepy gaze of early 20th century spectators. Finally, the 1904 marathon quietly influenced future Olympic planning. Organizers realized eventually that perhaps providing more water, smoothing roads, and discouraging the use of strychnine might improve outcomes. But these lessons were absorbed slowly, almost imperceptibly, leaving the 1904 marathon as a gentle, lingering cautionary tale about early athletics. So as we float away from the finish line, dust settling slowly over the course, let's consider the quiet legacy. It's not in medals, records, or heroic feats. It's in the human capacity to endure mildly absurd suffering, the strange resilience of participants, and the calm observation that sometimes history is most interesting when it's quietly chaotic. Take, for instance, the case of Albert Corey, a French born American runner. He finished second in the marathon, though his nationality was somewhat debated, leading to a polite shrug from officials. Corey ran steadily, without strychnine, without brandy, and without dogs chasing him. His pace was calm, consistent, and very, very dusty. He crossed the finish line tired, covered in dirt, and slightly bewildered by the chaotic atmosphere around him. In other words, exactly the kind of understated hero we can comfortably drift off thinking about. Then there were the men who didn't finish at all. Some collapsed from heat exhaustion, others wandered off the course, and a few quietly gave up after realizing that a 26-mile race in dust and confusion might not be their best idea. And yet, there's a subtle dignity here. No dramatic screaming, no fainting into hysteria, just quiet human endurance giving way to gentle surrender. History often overlooks these runners, but their stories add a mild, calming texture to the narrative of the marathon. Even the spectators had their moments of sleepy absurdity. Children waved quietly from the sidelines. Spectators fanned themselves lazily, and occasional dogs roamed freely. There's one account of a small group of fans offering sips of water and tiny morsels of food to passing runners, who accepted with the polite acknowledgement that this was all very kind, if slightly unconventional. It's the kind of small, everyday human kindness that makes the story endearing in a quiet, almost lulling way. And let's not forget the officials and organizers who, for all their mild incompetence, did their best to maintain order. They kept the start and finish lines clear, monitored the progress of the runners without panic, and recorded results with calm diligence. Some might argue that they could have done more, provided more water, smoothed the roads, or banned strychnine, but it's hard not to appreciate their understated resilience. They quietly oversaw one of the strangest marathons in history without losing composure, which is impressive in the most muted sense. By the time the event concluded, the 1904 marathon had quietly cemented itself as a peculiar, slightly absurd chapter in Olympic history, less about glory and more about endurance in the face of bizarre conditions. It stands out as a reminder that early athletics were not always elegant or heroic. They were at times dusty, mildly tragic, and gently ridiculous. In reflection, the marathon teaches us several things, slowly without fanfare. 1. Humans are surprisingly resilient, even under absurd circumstances. 2. Early Olympic organizers had a very relaxed approach to logistics, health, and minor ethical considerations. 3. Sometimes, the charm of history lies not in triumph, but in quietly surviving chaos. And so, as we settle into the final moments of this tale, imagine the scene once more. Runners trudging along dusty roads, some aided by dubious concoctions, others chased by dogs or hindered by heat. Spectators watch with mild curiosity. Officials record results with quiet diligence. The marathon ends, medals are awarded, and history whispers softly of the absurd endurance displayed that day. No roaring cheers, no dramatic speeches, just the gentle, persistent beat of human effort and the mild chaos that accompanied it. The 1904 Olympic Marathon remains a uniquely sleepy spectacle in history. It is remembered not for grand heroics, but for human perseverance, quiet absurdity, and the strange, lingering images of men staggering through dust, collapsing in exhaustion, and sometimes riding in cars without much consequence. It's a story that can be appreciated slowly, like a cup of lukewarm tea or the soft rustle of a late autumn wind. And with that, our tale of the 1904 Olympic Marathon gently comes to an end. Let's float into the story of Abraham Lincoln's funeral. Not just any funeral, because why settle for normal? But a funeral that in a sense lasted 74 years. Yes, you heard that right. 74. That's not a typo. You might want to settle in. Really settle in. Abraham Lincoln, the tall, bearded president who somehow managed to guide a nation through civil war, was assassinated on April 14th, 1865. And of course, people were very sad, understandably so. He had the kind of face you could stare at for a long time and still not be sure if it was serious or just thoughtful. His funeral was meant to be a proper farewell, but as it turns out, saying goodbye to Honest Abe was not going to be quick or simple. Now, the first strange thing about Lincoln's funeral is the logistics. The man was traveling a lot, even after death. And when I say traveling, I don't mean a leisurely road trip. I mean a coffin on a train, slowly moving from city to city so that Americans, scattered across the post war country, could file past, bow their heads, and maybe quietly wonder how they were going to rebuild the nation. His body was embalmed because why not make sure it lasted long enough to see all the cities along the rail line? The process itself was fairly new at the time, and Lincoln's body was one of the first presidential corpses to be embalmed. So there was that bit of scientific novelty floating around too. People were curious, gently horrified, and very, very patient. The funeral train traveled over 1,600 miles. It went from Washington, D.C. to Springfield, Illinois. That's about the distance from New York City to Atlanta, if you like to think in modern terms. But it wasn't about speed. No, the train moved slowly so that people in cities and small towns could witness the mourning, to feel part of this national grief. They called it a lying in state, but it was more like a very extended goodbye tour. You could almost imagine the train engineer whispering, "Please, just a little slower. I don't want anyone to miss it." Crowds gathered everywhere. In some cities, people waited hours, maybe even all night, just to glimpse the coffin. And here's the mildly absurd detail: the body was not always covered in heavy curtains. Sometimes you could actually see Lincoln lying there with his iconic beard, a suit that was probably a little creased from travel, and an expression that seems, well, eternally patient. It's almost like he knew this farewell was going to last decades. By the time the train reached Springfield, it had become less of a one-day event and more of a collective experience that lingered in memory. Funerals usually end with a quick nod and a few words of condolence. Lincoln's, however, had a way of stretching your sense of time. Families told stories of walking past the coffin, staring quietly, then stepping aside so the next person could do the same. Everyone was participating in a ceremony that felt gentle, somber, and oddly ceremonial. Now here's where the 74 years part comes in. Because, after the train ride and the final interment in Springfield, Lincoln's coffin did not stay put quietly forever. Oh no. His remains were moved multiple times. People seemed very concerned that if left alone, the coffin might be forgotten, or worse, stolen. Apparently, grave robbing was a minor worry even for presidents, so Lincoln's body was transferred into a series of increasingly secure vaults. These transfers were slow, meticulous, and involved elaborate ceremonies that anyone with a mild interest in decorum would appreciate. By the early 20th century, the final resting place was constructed, a crypt in Springfield, designed to hold the body forever, with marble, iron gates, and more locks than a small bank vault. But the care didn't stop. The caretakers checked the coffin periodically, just to make sure Lincoln hadn't decided to spontaneously resurrect and wander off. This level of diligence meant that technically, the funeral process, a continuous act of concern, ceremony, and vigil, lasted decades. People were, in a sense, still saying goodbye, even 74 years later. Along the way, there were small, almost comical incidents. One caretaker reportedly fainted during a transfer, overwhelmed by the combination of responsibility and the lingering scent of history. A few others noted that the iron fittings and marble occasionally required polishing, as if Lincoln's presence demanded maintenance. And maintenance, of course, is part of every long funeral. So the funeral wasn't just a single event in 1865. It became an ongoing ritual that spanned generations. Visitors came to Springfield not merely to see a tomb, but to feel that they were participating in something larger, something slow, and something eternal. The nation's grief, carried gently from city to city, and then from caretaker to caretaker, extended far beyond the typical 24-hour mourning period. Let's float over to another minor, but interesting detail. Lincoln's coffin itself was quite elaborate. It had multiple layers of protection, caskets within caskets, like a slightly morbid Russian nesting doll. There were reports of secret compartments, heavy locks, and at least one time when officials had to double check that the right body was still inside. This was necessary because, of course, people were worried about grave robbers and would-be souvenir collectors. Nothing says eternal respect quite like multiple metal locks. As decades passed, the funeral became less about mourning Lincoln personally and more about ritual and memory. Each generation added its own layer of reverence. Children of those who saw the train passed down stories. Newspapers printed accounts for nostalgia, and historians occasionally noted the slow progress of the coffin's journey. This is how a funeral stretched unofficially into what some historians call a 74-year-long ceremony of care, reflection, and ceremonial persistence. And there's something comforting about that. A president's death, usually a brief spike in public attention, was here extended into a meditation on history itself. People could, slowly, Think about the man who had led a fractured nation, who had a beard that seemed slightly too long, and who had now become part of the landscape of memory. So if you ever feel like funerals are too short, or like people move on too quickly, Lincoln's story is here to remind you that sometimes saying goodbye is a very long process, and that process can be gentle, continuous, and strangely comforting if you approach it with a calm, steady mind. We left off with Lincoln finally arriving in Springfield, Illinois. By this point, one might assume the long ceremonial ride was over, but of course, that would be far too simple for history. The posthumous life of Abraham Lincoln was destined to be slow, careful, and at times mildly absurd. The first thing to know is that the Springfield tomb was not just a place to put the body and leave it. No, that would be far too boring. Instead, the tomb was designed like a fortress of marble, iron, and general meticulousness. The casket, already a set of nested boxes, was placed in a specially constructed vault. There were iron gates, heavy locks, and a sense that if anyone wanted to touch Lincoln, they would first need a small army of keys, a letter of permission from some official nobody had ever met, and a calm demeanor. Over the next few decades, the caretakers of the tomb developed a routine. Periodically, they would open the outer casket, inspect the locks, and make sure everything was in order. These inspections were not rushed. The process was slow, methodical, and accompanied by that quiet sense of duty you feel when polishing a family heirloom that happens to contain a president. Now, the reason for this ongoing attention was in part practical. There was a lingering fear of grave robbers. Apparently, the idea that a president's body could be stolen and used for nefarious purposes was not entirely ridiculous at the time. It might sound like paranoia, but in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there were indeed incidents of stolen bodies or tampered graves. Lincoln's caretakers, therefore, became unofficial security experts, monitoring the tomb and maintaining a presence that was equal parts devotion and mild overcaution. In 1876, about a decade after the initial interment, something mildly dramatic happened. A group of men decided to break into the tomb. It was, according to reports, a poorly planned attempt at theft. The outer casket was tampered with, but the inner layers remained secure. In the aftermath, the tomb's management decided that more security was required because apparently the idea that someone might want a piece of Lincoln's resting place was very real. So new iron doors were installed, the locks were reinforced, and caretakers were instructed to be extra vigilant. By the early 20th century, Lincoln's posthumous fame had grown steadily. Memorial culture in the United States was becoming more formalized. People began to treat Lincoln's tomb not just as a burial place, but as a shrine, a slow-moving monument to reflection. Visitors came quietly, sometimes leaving small tokens of remembrance. Newspapers would occasionally publish stories about the tomb's inspections, giving readers the comforting knowledge that yes, Abraham Lincoln was still being cared for, still attended by dedicated, patient individuals. And so, the funeral persisted, not in the sense of flowers and condolences, but in the sense of continued attention, ritual, and gentle ceremony. Every generation of caretakers added its own layer of protocol. The body was not moved for spectacle, but for practical reasons, to ensure its preservation. And each move, each inspection, was accompanied by a mild form of ceremony. No music, no grand speeches, just slow, deliberate acts of care that stretch the concept of a funeral across decades. There were minor mishaps, naturally. Some caretakers fainted during inspections, overwhelmed by a combination of solemnity, responsibility, and perhaps the lingering scent of history. Others noted that the metalwork and marble occasionally needed polishing. There were reports of small accidents with tools, minor scratches on the vault, and endless discussions about the best way to ensure Lincoln remained undisturbed. All of this contributed to the ongoing sense that the funeral was not yet finished. It's worth noting that the coffin itself was a marvel of protective engineering. Layers of metal, wood, and fabric insulated the remains. The outer casket was iron, the inner casket bronze, and then there were multiple layers of wood padding and seals. Each layer was checked periodically, sometimes with the help of specialized tools, to ensure that decay was minimal and that the body remained secure. In a way, the funeral became an extended exercise in preservation science, executed at a leisurely pace. By the 1930s and 1940s, Lincoln's tomb had become a kind of cultural landmark. Families visiting Springfield often stopped to view the tomb. Children who had grown up hearing stories of the funeral train would bring their own children to see the final resting place. The continuous care of the casket, the slow inspections, and the ritualized attention meant that technically, Lincoln's funeral had not truly ended. Each new caretaker, each new visitor, was participating in a long, drawn out ceremonial goodbye. Even historical scholarship contributed to the sense of continuity. Books were written about Lincoln's life and death. Articles recounted the unusual extended funeral, and historians gently noted that the process of mourning the president was unusually prolonged. The public, in turn, continued to recognize the site as sacred and, in a subtle way, kept the act of saying goodbye alive. One of the mildly amusing aspects of this drawn out funeral is that it required a certain degree of patience from everyone involved. Visitors, caretakers, and even historians needed to accept that the process was slow, unexciting, and in the modern sense, a little tedious. But it was exactly that tediousness that contributed to its charm. No sudden shocks, no dramatic moments, just steady, careful attention over the decades. Let's float over to a final detail in this segment. In the mid 20th century, the tomb was further reinforced. Modern techniques for preservation were introduced, and the casket's interior was occasionally checked. The outer structure was maintained, ensuring that Lincoln's resting place remained secure against both environmental decay and human curiosity. By this point, the funeral had become a continuous ritual of maintenance, reflection, and calm observation, a 74-year meditation on mortality, memory, and national reverence. So by the time the 1970s rolled around, Lincoln's funeral, in a sense, was concluding. The final inspections and care routines ensured that the body would remain undisturbed for the foreseeable future. Historians looked back and noted the unusual longevity of the process, and the nation could quietly appreciate that the man who had guided them through Civil War had posthumously received an unprecedented level of care and attention. And so, the story of Lincoln's funeral serves as a gentle reminder. Sometimes, saying goodbye isn't about a single day, a single event, or a single set of flowers. Sometimes, saying goodbye is a slow, continuous, and deliberate process that stretches across decades, weaving together generations, caretakers, and the quiet rituals of remembrance. By the 1970s, the story of Abraham Lincoln's funeral had become less about public display and more about quiet care. The long, drawn out process of attention, inspection, and ceremonial maintenance had finally slowed to a rhythm almost imperceptible. Lincoln, the man who had faced civil war and guided a fractured nation, now rested in a place where the only movement was the slow passage of caretakers, ensuring that his legacy and his body remained undisturbed. Visitors still came to Springfield, though far fewer than during the train tour of 1865. Some came to honor history, others out of curiosity. Children who had grown up hearing stories about the funeral train or the multiple casket layers now brought their own children, gently passing down tales of patience, reverence, and a slightly unusual form of national mourning. The story of Lincoln's funeral had become a cultural meditation, a way for Americans to reflect on continuity, memory, and respect. The caretaker's work had become quieter, almost ritualistic. By then, modern preservation methods reduced the need for constant physical inspections. Marble was polished, iron gates checked, locks maintained, but the urgency had softened. The funeral, in essence, had transitioned into a long, ongoing meditation on respect and remembrance, stretching from the 19th century into the late 20th. And yet, even as the decades passed, there was something almost poetic in the slowness of it all. The nation did not rush to say goodbye to Lincoln. Instead, the act of farewell was extended, almost as if the very fabric of American memory had conspired to hold him close, to keep him present, and to remind everyone who came that sometimes the simplest gestures, checking locks, polishing marble, walking slowly past a coffin, carry the deepest meaning. In the end, the 74-year-long funeral was not about spectacle or even grief. It was about continuity, about generations quietly participating in the act of remembrance, about the patience of caretakers, the curiosity of visitors, and the gentle, pervasive presence of history itself. Lincoln's final resting place became more than a tomb. It became a symbol of enduring respect, a slow-moving monument to the care a nation can show, even long after the final words have been spoken. And so, as we gently lay down the story tonight, it's worth remembering the quiet lessons of Lincoln's long farewell. Sometimes, goodbyes are not measured in hours or days, but in decades. Sometimes, care is slow, deliberate, and understated. And sometimes, history itself demands patience. So dim the lights a little more. Let your body sink into the comfort of the night. Think, if you like, of slow trains, marble halls, iron gates, and the patient, enduring presence of a president who never hurried through life, nor through the centuries of memory that followed him. Good night, sleep well, and may your dreams be calm, steady, and perhaps just a little historical.